First of all, happy International Workers' Day to everybody. We're very pleased to be here to launch our document on workers' rights on May Day. It's fair to say that over the last 7 years of austerity, we've seen a huge burden put on working people and the unemployed, and we've seen the political right and some in the business community take the opportunity of the recession not to waste it from their perspective and also to undermine workers' rights at every opportunity. We've seen it, for example, with the abolition of the JLCs and the challenges to the protections which are in place to allow sectors to collectively bargain for their wages. The Sunday premium, for example, being removed for low-paid workers. We've seen pay cuts for people in the public and the private sector. We saw through Croke Park and Haddington Road that hard-fought gains that were made by workers in the public sector and indeed in the private sector were set aside by a Labour Party in government. And that's the backdrop in which we're launching our policy document today. Last year, as a state, we celebrated the centenary of the 1913 lockout. I think it was a disgrace that as we celebrated that, we still do not have the right to be represented by our trade union and to collectively bargain enshrined in law. And we still have a number of employers in this state who will not recognise trade unions and will not allow groups of workers to be represented by their trade unions. We're one of only 3 countries in the European Union which does not have collective bargaining enshrined in law. So we're very clear that as we now talk about economic recovery, as we talk about building an economy, that the economy has to be there to serve the people and that workers' rights has to be central to any economic recovery, because workers deserve to be treated fairly, deserve to be treated decently. We need to make sure that people have money in their pockets, and the more money people have in their pockets, the better it is for the economy generally. So we are very much supportive of policies and workers' rights proposals which support low and middle income families especially, and that's what our proposals are about. It's also, I suppose, important to point out over the last number of years we've seen a very large number of high-profile sit-in protests where people have had to sit in to get their basic rights as workers vindicated. We saw what happened to the Talk workers in Waterford, and that, I think, was a turning point for many people. It wasn't just that the company left and there were 600 jobs gone. It was the brutal way in which that was done, where workers learned of their jobs being lost through the media rather than by their employers. We saw the sit-in protest of Waterford Crystal, Vita Cortex. We saw what happened to the lag and brick workers and so many others. Again, there was a lot of workers who engaged in very high-profile sit-in protests to have basic rights vindicated. That's not the way it should be. And what we're about in Sinn Féin is to make sure there is strong, robust employment rights protections enshrined in law for workers to make sure that people don't have to engage in these type of sit-in protests. It's also interesting to point out that if you look at the government's programme for government and the commitments they've given in relation to workers' rights, we're 3 years into their term of office and they still have not delivered on the core promises that were even in the programme for government that would protect workers. So it shows the priority that I think both parties, both Fine Gael and Labour, attach to workers' rights. We're still waiting for the Workplace Relations Bill, for example, to be published. That's to improve the employment rights architecture in this state, to create a single point of contact for workers. We support that as long as there's robust protections for workers in it, but we're still waiting for the legislation on that issue. And as I said, a core proposal and a promise by the Labour Party, and people will remember during the Lisbon Treaty when there was a discussion on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and it was implicit in that charter that collective bargaining was seen as a fundamental right. Eamon Gilmore promised the trade unions that if they supported Lisbon Mark II, that we would have collective bargaining. Well, we're still waiting for it, and we're 3 years into this government's term of office, and the centenary of the lockout has passed without any movement in that direction. So there's a number of things we're calling for in the document. Obviously, first and foremost, it is important that workers can be represented by their trade unions. So we're calling for collective bargaining legislation that's in line with the International Labour Organisation's conventions on workers' rights, that's in keeping with the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, and that collective bargaining and trade union recognition, which is equally important, because it's vitally important that if we have some form of collective bargaining, it isn't the yellow pack collective bargaining where employers can bypass trade unions and set up workplace committees. That has to be an explicit recognition of what constitutes a trade union and a protection of trade unions and people's right to join a trade union. So we certainly would want that, and we will study the detail of any proposals the government bring forward. But we're asking them to do it as quickly as possible. It should have been done up to now. We also want to make sure that low-paid workers are protected. We want the Sunday premium, for example, that was removed when the JCBs, so the JLCs were set aside, that they are dealt with, and also that low-paid workers are protected generally. So we are very much supportive of making sure that workers' rights are front and centre, that we protect workers, and that we make sure that we take the opportunity of a recovering economy, which we all want to see, to make sure that workers are protected.